Now, Syrian government forces take back control of Homs, claiming a symbolic victory in their fight against rebel forces. The city, once called the capital of the revolution, has been at the very heart of the uprising in Syria. What effect will its fall have on the wider conflict? Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Syria. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, hundreds of fighters surrendered their Homs stronghold this week in a deal that allowed them safe passage to other rebel-held areas. And as government troops moved into the city in central Syria, hundreds of civilians began returning to see what was left of their homes. Well, to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Osama bin Javed.
Debris is what remains of streets, and the shells of buildings welcome back the residents of Homs. This was once seen as the capital of the Syrian revolution, and it's now back under government control. It took months and help from Iran and Russia to broker a deal, under which government forces allowed fighters to leave Homs in return for access to pro-government villages in the north. Many residents are returning here after years of a government siege of the rebel-held city.
I could not enter my home through the door. I entered through a hole in the wall. Everything surrounding the house is damaged. The house has only columns.
These neighborhoods have seen relentless artillery and air attacks. During its siege, people of Homs were also denied access to food and medicine. The UN's aid chief for the country says it's a strategy being used all over Syria.
Denying humanitarian access is a tactic in this conflict, and starvation, increasing the misery of those in places that are besieged, places that are denied access to humanitarian assistance, is a tactic that is being utilized, and it's not acceptable.
Just ahead of so-called elections in Syria, taking back Aleppo is being seen as a major win for President Bashar al-Assad. But intense fighting rages on in many other parts. The rebels say they've given up Homs as a tactical retreat. Amid all this, the death toll continues to mount. Aid workers are warning that the world is becoming numb to both the scale and the extent of the brutality of the Syrian conflict. Osama bin Javed for Inside Syria.
All right, let me now introduce our guests on this show. I have joining me here in the studio Marwan Kabalan. He's a Syrian writer and academic and associate political analyst at the Doha Institute. And in Washington, D.C., we have Isabel Nassif, a research analyst at the Institute for the Study of War and a specialist on Syrian politics and security. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Marwan here in the studio now. The fall of Homs, is this a turning point, a breakthrough for the regime?
I don't think so. It's another episode in this bloody civil war which has been going on for the past 3 years.
Well, they got the capital, the so-called capital of the revolution, the heart of the revolution. Can the revolution beat without the heart?
Even though I think if you look at the map of the conflict right now, you can see that the two parties are fighting like fiercely. Yeah, in other parts of the country, in Aleppo, in Idlib, you can see the opposition making progress, limited progress, in the south, in Quneitra and in Daraa. They have made also progress in some other parts in the north. So this is, for me, is just another battle in this war. I don't see it as a turning point. Indeed, a symbolic, maybe, victory for the regime. But it's not going to end this war. This war, in my opinion, is not winnable. Neither side can win it. The regime cannot regain control over the country. The opposition cannot defeat the regime. There is this regional and international decision not to allow either party to win this war. So I think it's not going to change.
That's an interesting point, which I want to pick up on, that point that you're making about some kind of regional, international decision to keep a stalemate. Very interesting. Before we do that, though, let me bring in Isabel into the discussion here. And Isabel, you know, you can listen to analysts like Marwan who say that this war is not winnable. The regime has a different line, though. It says it is winning the war. How representative is the setback in Homs of the whole battle overall that's going on in the country? Are the rebels on the back footing overall?
Yes, I agree with Marwan. The battle is largely stalemated. The fall of Homs' old city is more of a symbolic victory for the regime than it's of little tactical significance in the overall conflict. Rebels are on the offensive in Latakia, in other parts of the north, and in the south.
Well, aren't they in a stronger, are not regime forces now in a stronger position, so the theory goes, once they've got Homs, to make a push into some of the other key opposition-held areas in the north?
Well, I think one thing that's important to focus on here is that the regime did not defeat rebels in the old city of Homs. They simply displaced them. And what has happened time and time again throughout the conflict, particularly in Homs province, is that rebels reconstitute forces in other parts of the countryside once the regime has pushed them out of an urban center. And I would expect to see that happen again in Homs over the next couple months.
Interesting, Marwan. We've seen Homs change hands, or at least parts of Homs have changed hands quite a lot throughout this battle. Could the center of Homs, which is being surrendered, change hands again, do you think? Or
I think the strategy of the regime has always been like controlling the centers of big cities and leaving the countrysides, actually make the war actually taking place in the remote parts of the country. So that is something that the regime thinks it can live with. But right now, when the regime is planning to have presidential election, I think it's mainly focused on having or regaining the centers, and Homs is, in my opinion, indeed is a very of significant importance in the sense that the regime can now claim that this is Homs, this is the capital of the revolution, I got it back. But on the other hand, as I
but do you
said,
think they can hang on to it?
I think they will hang on to it because the rebels in this particular area in the center of Homs are not very strong in my opinion. This has become part of the regime strategy to connect what it's called the useful Syria, the capital in the south, with Homs in the middle or the center of the country, with the west, with the coast on the northwest part of the country. I think the regime will try to keep this under its control, and it will try, on the other hand, regain control over other parts. I don't think the rebel will regain control over the city. They will control, indeed, as they do now in some parts of the countryside of Homs, but not the center of Homs.
All right, let me bring Isabel back into the discussion then. De facto, does the fall of Homs perhaps further cement the division which has already appeared in Syria? You've got some Kurdish-held areas, regime-held areas in the west, and opposition-held areas in the north. Is that pretty much how this show is going to go on, if we're talking about a stalemate?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Definitely in terms of logistical connections on the ground, this does further cement that separation. But I think something noteworthy about the truce that resulted in the rebels leaving Homs Old City is that it was a cross-front effort. So in return for rebels leaving Homs Old City, rebels in northern Syria allowed regime access into the besieged towns of Nibal and Zahra. So that sort of cross-front coordination is something that we should look to in the future.
All right, since we're talking about the Homs deal, let's take a little look about some of the details in that deal then. Well, under the agreement, rebel fighters have been allowed to withdraw from Homs under UN supervision. They were allowed to take only light weapons with them, leaving heavy artillery behind. There's also an option for rebels to reconcile with the government. In return, rebels agreed to allow aid into 2 pro-government towns in the north that they've been besieging for more than a year. Well, activists say the truce also hinged on the release of a Russian military officer, dozens of pro-government fighters, and an Iranian woman being held by rebels. Let's continue with the discussion here. Marwan, I'm wondering whether there's been any change in the level of international support for the opposition. About the same time as we were getting news of a deal for the rebels to pull out of Homs, we also had something of an upgrading of the US diplomatic recognition for parts of the opposition, like the SNC, didn't we? Is that a significant development?
That's true, and we have to recognize that this is a war by proxy in Syria. We have 3 levels of conflict here. We have the local, the regional, and the international. And as I said earlier, this war is not winnable because you have you have the parties who are the regional and international parties who are supporting their proxies inside Syria, i.e. the regime and the opposition, is not going to allow their own allies to lose, I mean, this conflict. This is why I guess the war is not in the first place winnable. When the United States, I think when the United States thought that the opposition might be actually losing to the regime, they not only actually upgraded the their diplomatic status in Washington, but they also, I think, they started to provide more lethal assistance or aid to the opposition by giving the TOW, anti-armored
anti-tank weapons, missiles.
Yeah, that's true. And this is because the Americans, they believe now they have, in order to have a political solution to the crisis, this problem, and this has been the U.S. position for a couple of years now. I think they want to change the balance of power on the ground by trying to put more pressure on the regime in order to try to have another round, perhaps, of talks between the opposition and the regime, and get the regime to agree to have a political settlement, I mean, to this conflict.
Isabel, if I'm following what Marwan's saying here correctly, the backers, or at least some of the backers of the opposition in Syria, just want to keep them strong enough and alive enough to keep this battle going on. Is that your perception of how much support some of the international backers want to give to the opposition?
Yeah, what you've seen so far is, particularly with the recent trip of Jarba to the United States, a lot of political maneuvers to legitimize the Syrian coalition, but a general lack of genuine support to rebels on the ground. There have been some limited increases in lethal aid. So as Marwan said, the TOW anti-tank missiles. But
so is that not a game changer, Isabel? The supplying of, I mean, according to the media reports, they talk about this as some kind of pilot program that if it works out and if they're able to see that the so-called end user concern is not an issue whose hands these weapons finally fall into, that perhaps better weapons, bigger weapons, more effective anti-aircraft weapons could be supplied. Is that wishful thinking?
Well, you know, that's the intention. What it seems like is a pilot program. It remains to be seen if that will continue. The real inflection point here would be a steady stream of supply of more weapons. The Syrian regime lacks manpower, and the way it overcomes that limitation is it leverages its air power. So it's able to extend into rebel-held territory where it cannot put ground troops. So its advantage point is the air power, and weapons like man-pads would give rebels a chance to level the playing field. All
right, Marwan, of course, we're talking about the international backers as if they're all united. How much coordination is there amongst the supporters of the opposition right now when you talk about everyone from the United States to Qatar to Saudi Arabia?
Well, this is actually what makes I mean, the difference between the backers of the opposition and the backers of the regime. Whereas we find, for example, the Russians, the Iranians, they would almost agree on most of the things in order to keep the Syrian regime alive and not allow it actually to collapse. On the other hand, we have the allies or the backers of the Syrian opposition. They have too many disagreements, actually.
So there's no common strategy.
That's very true. That's very true, because we have
it's not becoming more common as a result of the regime making gains on the ground in some of the areas in Syria?
Every single backer of the regime, of the opposition, actually, is having their own people on the ground in Syria, and they are not coordinating, in my opinion. Everybody is trying to establish its own patronage inside the country by having groups that are implementing its own agenda. We have, I know that the Americans are trying now, the Americans are complaining now that the Saudis, they have their own people, the Qataris, they have their own people, the Turks, they have their own people. Everybody almost seems to have their own people on the ground. The Americans are not having anybody, I think.
So, Isabel, has the recent change in the leadership of the Saudi intelligence made any difference to the respective policies of those countries towards Syria?
Well, generally one place I think you can look to for coordination amongst outside backers is in the south, in Dara and Quneitra, where you've seen a concerted effort, continual success by rebels in making operational gains which suggests a coordinated effort by the Jordanians and the Saudis and U.S. intelligence.
Well, we heard from the UN's humanitarian chief in our earlier report. Well, in that same briefing on Friday, he made an impassioned plea for the world to sit up and take notice of the conflicts in Syria.
So far, all that we've heard are words. Words of condemnation, words of sympathy, and so forth for the people on the ground. Yes, the valid question to ask those political leaders is, how many poor people will you accept to be killed before you do something different? Because it's 5,000 a month at the moment, and it's over 150,000 already. Is it 200,000? Is it 250,000? Is it 1 million people? What is the trigger for a new action in response to what is an escalating situation? We have heard on the refugee issue, they just continue to grow. Is it 3 million refugees a trigger for new action by political leaderships? Is it 4 million? Is it the collapse of Lebanon and Jordan? You know, all that we can do as humanitarians is we can only report to you what's happening on the ground. And our duty is, even if it's not new news, because there is no new news here in terms of any different news, but the new news is that it's getting worse, and dramatically so.
And Isabel, the world doesn't seem to have an answer right now for that question. What is the trigger?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. One of the greatest impediments to forcing a solution to the conflict is a lack of international will. And the Assad regime knows that, and we've seen the regime time and time again take advantage of that. For example, with the chemical weapons removal process right now, the regime has been able to leverage that to deter international intervention, and the use of denial of military aid as a tactic is in line with previous regime actions.
All right, talking about what perhaps may be being triggered, more ethnic and religious division. Is that what's going on? Perhaps the fall of Homs, the participation or the role played by the National Defense Force, this force that draws mainly on minorities or heavily on minorities in Syria. Are these symptoms of that hardening problem of ethnic and religious lines being drawn deeper and deeper in Syria?
Indeed, I think this is one of the problems that we have to deal with in Syria for a long, long time to come. And,
it didn't used to be like this, though.
It wasn't like this, but
worrying.
I think when you have like 3 years of conflict, bloody conflict, and more than 200,000 people already dead, yeah, maybe I mean this estimate is humble in the opinion of some people, but you have too much blood now in Syria, and you have people, and the society, Syrian society is very much divided according to the sectarian and religious fault lines. So I think yes, we are going to have to live with this problem for decades perhaps to come. But I still think that this is only one aspect of this crisis. The humanitarian aspect is another one. But I think we have to deal, we should keep our eye on the ball. This is something that the international community should deal with the problem, not with the aspects of this problem or the outcome of this problem. The humanitarian crisis is just one outcome of this conflict. I think we have to focus more on the political issue, on the political problem, in order to stop actually the killing, to stop the fighting in the country, in order to stop the flood of Syrian refugees into neighboring countries by stopping this conflict first. Of course, I mean, the humanitarian aid is very important. I would encourage every government and also non-governmental organization to do their best.
But how do you stop the conflict? That does seem to be the problem. There doesn't seem to be an international consensus on how you do that.
I think the lack of will, as it has already been mentioned, the lack of will by the international community is, in my opinion, the key reason why this conflict has been taking place for 3 years now. And I think mainly on the part of the Americans, mainly on the part of the Obama administration. This administration has been very hesitant from the very beginning to do anything on Syria. And it has been giving mixed, actually, messages, mixed signals, I mean, to the to all parties of this conflict, and that is why we got here in the first place.
All right, so Isabel, not a lot of consensus among the backers of the opposition, not a lot of international consensus on how to end this war. Within the inner circle of the ruling regime in Syria, within the army, how is consensus and cohesiveness today? I mean, some were talking about a year or more ago about how the army would break up, the inner circle would fragment. Does the fall of places like Homs show that the opposite is happening?
Right. Well, there haven't been any new defections within the Syrian military, but it's important to understand that the Syrian Arab army ceases to be a professional army as we once understood it. It has really devolved into a militia. The main fighting force of the regime are these pro-regime militias, namely the National Defense Forces, and it is largely made up of Iraqi Shia militias, Hezbollah, assistance from the IRGC. So this understanding of the regime as a cohesive, monolithic force is fundamentally false. The proliferation of armed forces on the side of the regime is as grave as it is on the opposition side.
Yeah, but talking about the opposition, what is happening to their ranks? And this year began with them with greater infighting between factions of the opposition. When they see places like Homs falling, does that encourage them to unite? Are we seeing more coordination between them?
Well, I think it's important to note that the rebel infighting that you're referencing is specifically rebel groups fighting against the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham. That is the extension of al-Qaeda in Iraq into Syria. So it's not so much intra-Syrian opposition fighting as it is the Syrian opposition fighting against the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham.
All right, let's talk, Marwan, a little bit about another big event on the calendar. We've got presidential elections in June.
Yes.
Very little doubt that Assad will win on the minds of most observers, right?
This shows actually how detached, this regime has been from the very beginning from reality on the ground. And this shows also the approach of this regime, that I have my plan. I will actually execute this plan regardless of what's happening in the country. And they will, in my opinion, have this election regardless of what's going on in other parts of the country. They will go with this election in the places that they can have presidential.
They're not going to be able to have an election in the whole country, though.
Of course. But
they don't run the whole country.
But you don't have also half of the population are
refugees or displaced.
Either inside Syria or outside Syria. But I don't think that the regime cares much about this. I think the regime is mainly concerned about telling everybody that, look, I am doing what I please, and I don't care what the international community thinks of me. I don't care what Syrians think of me, because the regime has, from the very beginning, completely indifferent. To what the Syrians actually think of him. So I think this is something that the regime has been okay. We have the Geneva process. We have the fighting, we have almost everything. We can do all that while at the same time I am having my own plan being, as I said, executed. So that was the approach of the regime from the very beginning.
It was indeed. Isabel, regardless of how clean these elections are and how inclusive they are, and there are a lot of concerns about that, would a win for President Assad in June elections bolster his claim for international legitimacy in any way?
That is up to the international community. I think it's perfectly clear that these are sham elections.
But how do you read the readiness of some countries, perhaps Russia, Iran, or maybe even some Western countries who are sort of sitting here thinking, do we really want either side to win? How do you expect and analyze their response to be?
Well, Russia and Iran will certainly use the elections as a bid for international legitimacy for the Assad regime, but I think it's quite clear that there's no outcome for a stable Syria that involves the Assad regime.
All right, I think
and these elections should not be...
Oh, go ahead. I'll let you get the final word in. Please, go ahead.
I was just going to add that these elections should in no way be considered a legitimizing factor for the Assad regime, which is the biggest radicalizing force among Syrian opposition forces.
All right, I think we will have to end it here and thank our guests in Washington, D.C., Isabel Nassif, a research analyst at the Institute for the Study of War and a specialist on Syrian politics and security. Let's also thank Marwan Kabalan, a Syrian writer and academic and associate political analyst at the Doha Institute. Thank you for joining us. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, on air and online. I'm Sami Zaidan. Thanks for joining us.